The magic user. Weak, squishy, and some folks would say nearly useless at first level. One spell and they were done. So why did anyone choose to play a magic user? Let's find out today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about the magic user class from the TSR editions of Dungeons & Dragons. So if you're brand new to the game, maybe you started it basically anytime after the year 2000 with 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition. And quite honestly, even if you might have started with the later part of 2nd edition, you might not be familiar with the term magic user, but magic user was originally the term that was used to describe what now would be called a wizard. Although, as you can tell from the name, it is much more generic and it's all encompassing. So very similar to the way that in original Dungeons and Dragons, the term fighting man was used to describe what is now called a fighter, and being someone who makes their way through life by fighting, a fighting person. Magic user was basically a generic term to describe somebody who makes their way through life by using magic. So I always kind of thought it was a clunky term as well when I was growing up, as well as fighting man. So I prefer fighter. However, I do think that there's something kind of unique about the term magic user because it allows you to envision however you want to play this magic using character. So starting with 3rd edition, things started to get spread apart where, they divided wizards and sorcerers into two different things, even though they have the same spell list in 3rd edition. And then you get warlocks coming in later on with it. But all of them are just arcane casters. And the magic user class originally was intended to encompass all of those different things. Witches and necromancers and whatever it was, they were all magic users. And then through role play and spell selection is how you would differentiate them. Okay, so this is kind of going to be a bit of a companion piece to the video that I did on fighters, and you don't have to have watched that to have watched this. But if you're trying to learn about how these classes have changed over time, then you might want to go back and check that out at a certain point. But what I'm talking about again is the evolution of the magic user class through the TSR editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So TSR is the company that published Dungeons and Dragons prior to Wizards of the Coast acquiring the company and therefore the rights to Dungeons and Dragons in 1997. So that's going to include the original edition of D&D from 1974, the Holmes Basic edition from 1977, the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition from 1981, the BECMI edition from 1983, and then of course you have Advanced Dungeons and Dragons from 1977. Well, 1977 through 79, that was 3 years before all the books were released. And then 2nd edition in 1989. And then along the way, I'm going to be talking about and adding in some kind of half steps that are not official editions, but do change the magic user class. So specifically things like Greyhawk, 1975, published the year after Dungeons & Dragons was published. Unearthed Arcana from 1985, which made some changes. And then I'm going to, at the very end, do a little bit of looking at stuff like the Complete Wizard's Handbook from 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And then also one of my favorite of the Gazetteer series is the Principalities of Glantri, 1987. Okay, so that is kind of like what's coming. And the way that I'm going to divide all of this up is kind of looking at a standard first level magic user and then how they would be played in all of these different editions. Now, one of the things I'm not necessarily going to get into too much in this video is the Vancian magic system, which is part of especially the TSR era of Dungeons and Dragons. There's remnants of it left as you get into 3rd, 4th, and 5th, but especially in 4th, they're hardly there at all. And the Vancian magic system, if you are not familiar with that, is named after Jack Vance, the author. And interestingly enough, some people might not know this, but the monster Vecna is a mixed up version of Jack Vance's name. That's where the name comes from. And Jack Vance, in his stories, especially the Dying Earth stories, has a magic system that will be familiar to people who played earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, which is that a magic user memorizes a spell and it imprints on his brain. It's like one of the editions explains it's like writing chalk on a blackboard. However, once that spell is cast, it's like the chalk has been erased. You can always write it back, but for the time being, it's gone. Okay, so it's called the fire and forget system, colloquially. And I did a whole video about that before that delves into that and why D&D Magic was created that way, and also give reasons as to why I think it's actually a really cool magic system that I much prefer to like spell points and things like that. And so you'll want to watch that video if you want to understand a little bit more about that system. So, and again, I'm not going to really be diving into that too much in this particular video. And also, I've been throwing around a lot of terms here. I mentioned things like Holmes and Holmes Basic and BECMI and things like that. So if those are terms that are unfamiliar to you and you don't know what I'm talking about, you might want to check out my video on the history of D&D editions. It's a quick 20-minute video. It's one of the very first that I made on my channel. And it's the video that was responsible for my channel shifting its focus away from reviews of independent tabletop role-playing games and moving into history of Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games. And so it goes through in those 20 minutes roughly all the editions of D&D that had been published up until the point of when I made the video, which was going to cut off with 5th edition. I made it in 2023. So by that point, the new edition, the 2024 edition, wasn't out yet. But it will help you understand all these acronyms and stuff, even if you just need a refresher or if you've never heard of them before. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. I'm just going to go edition by edition, and I'm going to explain how this first level magic user would be played in that edition. I rolled some stats earlier, and I'll go over that in a second, because I just wanted to show you how those stats would impact the way that this magic user is played, because the stat bonuses and penalties and all that stuff are different edition by edition. The main thing I'm going to focus on is the casting and acquisition of spells, because that's really what helps us define the magic user. But I will be talking about some other things as well. So if that kind of history and these deep dives of learning about the classes of D&D and the different elements that make up the game that we play now, if that kind of stuff is something that you find interesting, informative, and fun, then please take just a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and then make sure that you've adjusted the settings on that bell icon so that YouTube will notify you when I upload a new video. Usually it's going to be every week on Tuesdays at 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. Pacific time. And if I'm not going to upload at that time, then I will usually let you know in a community post ahead of time so that you'll know that the video is going to be delayed. All right, so let's start out. And first, I'm going to tell you the stats I rolled. So the one thing I did was I did set the intelligence for this character. And these are going to be the same stats we use across the board for all these different editions. I set the intelligence at 18, so that was just DM fiat. Of course, if I was running an actual game, I would make the player roll. But the rest of the stats I rolled in order. So, and I rolled them in order according to the original D&D stats and the order that those were presented in. And so this character ended up with a strength of 11. And then again, I set the intelligence at 18, a wisdom of 9, a constitution of 12. So an original D&D con was before Dex. That's going to be changed later, pretty early, but I'm going by the original one. So the con was 12. Interestingly, the dexterity was 17. So they got a pretty good roll there. And then I got an 8 for charisma. Okay, so those are the stats that we're looking at. And so I'll be referring back to those from time to time as we go through these editions. So let's look at original D&D and figure out some things that this magic user is going to do. So first, let's read the description here, 1974. This is Men in Magic. And it says, magic users. This is the description right out the gate. Top level magic users are perhaps the most powerful characters in the game, but it is a long, hard road to the top. And to begin with, they are weak. So survival is often the question unless fighters protect the low-level magical types until they have worked up. The whole plethora of enchanted items lies at the magic user's beck and call, save the arms and armor of the fighters. And then it says, see, however, else. Magic users may arm themselves with daggers only. Wizards and above may manufacture for their own use or for sale such items as potions, scrolls, and just about anything else magical. Costs are commensurate with the value of the item, as is the amount of game time required to enchant. So when it says wizards and above may manufacture for their own use, what they're talking about is level titles. So if you've seen my videos before, you know that all of these editions, with the exception of second edition D&D, are going to use or second edition advanced D&D, are going to use level titles for the different character classes to define their abilities. So you see here for magic users, they start out at medium, and it doesn't even say level 1. You just have to kind of like, I guess, count the rows and figure out. So medium is level 1, seer's level 2, conjurer's level 3, and so on. And then you get all the way up here to wizard, which is an 11th level magic user. Okay, so at an 11th level and above, that is when you can manufacture these items, as it says here. So it says that they're weaker compared to other classes, and a lot of people think that, and I think people put too much stock in that because it's something that's just been repeated over and over and over to the point that people just assume that they are weaker without really necessarily having a way to explain how they're weaker. And so let's talk about what I mean by that. Well, the first thing is, again, if we know anything from original D&D, one of the things that I've talked about time and time and time again is the idea that all characters, classes, and there's only 3 in original D&D. It's fighters or fighting men, magic users, and clerics. Okay, so all of them use D6 for their hit points. So the fighting man starts out at 1 + 1. So that's 1 hit die of D6 + 1. So they're going to be on a range of 2 to 7. Most likely they're going to be 4.5, right? If on average, so 3.5 would be that halfway point of a D6, and then you're going to add that +1 for 4.5. Now, the fighter might have a Constitution bonus, but that's not guaranteed because remember, you're rolling your stats in order. So, and when I rolled, I got a Constitution of 12, which gives no bonus for my magic user character. Okay, so but the magic user starts out at 1 hit die, so they're going to get 3.5 hit points at first level on average. Okay, so that's not that much different. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the magic user is that they can use daggers. It says they use daggers. Well, it turns out in original D&D, and I've talked about this before, all weapons do D6 damage. So it doesn't matter if you're using a dagger or a two-handed sword or a lance or whatever it is. Every weapon does 1d6 damage. So a fighter with a sword attacking a magic user with a dagger, they're each going to do the same amount of damage when they hit. And the chances are that one hit is probably going to take them out. Now, the one advantage that the fighter has is that they can equip themselves with better armor. However, at first level, they probably don't have enough money to buy that great of armor. It's going to be better than any armor that the magic user gets because the magic user can't have any. But also, they're going to attack at the same rate. So it gives you the fighting capability here, which is based on chainmail. I'm not going to get into that now. I have a whole video that I recently just did about the origins of chainmail, how to play it, and how to use it with original D&D. That was last week's video. If we look at the alternative combat system, it's showing you the 20-sided die score that you need to hit by level. And so for level 1 through 3, to hit somebody with plate, armor, and shield, you need a 17. And then it says this is for fighting men. And it says magic users advance in steps based on 5 levels per group. So they advance on 1 to 5. They're going to be the same, whereas fighters are 1 to 3, level 1 to 3. And then at level 4, a fighter goes up in their fighting capability. A magic user has to wait until level 5 to go up in their capability. However, at first level, the fighter, the magic user, and the cleric are all at the same ability of fighting as far as their class is concerned, and they're all going to do the same amount of damage if they hit. So really the only thing that's making the magic user weaker in this case is that, again, they don't have armor. The fighter does get that +1 bump to the hit points, so sure. But, for the most part, if a magic user maybe hangs back from combat and throws their dagger at range, and in original D&D, they would get a bonus to throw from range because of the high dexterity score. So remember, I told you when I rolled my stats, I got a 17 for my dexterity. Well, it turns out that having a 17 in my dexterity means that I fire any missile at +1. I have to have a 12 or higher at +1. So the magic user is going to be +1 to hit. So going to be better than the fighter because in original D&D, the fighter doesn't get a bonus to their strength from their strength to hit. That's not going to come until later. So it's quite possible that my magic user with a dex of 17 throwing a dagger into melee or into combat from distance is going to be better to hit than the fighter, and it's going to remove the magic user from the chance of being hit. So they're just as good at fighting, and their dagger's going to do d6 damage. Again, remember, there's no damage bonus, again, for strength in here either for the fighter. So especially in original D&D, the magic user really isn't that any weaker than any other character other than that armor thing, right? So now the dexterity bonus is not going to give us an original D&D. It's not going to give us a bonus to our armor class. So that is a detriment, right? So that 17 is irrelevant as far as making our armor class better in original D&D. Okay, so but that just kind of gives you a sense of, you know, how this magic user might equip themselves or might work during combat versus any other class or monster that they encounter. Okay, so and on top of all that, they have a spell that the fighter doesn't have. They only have one spell. And we're going to talk about that, but they have an ability that the other classes don't have. Clerics at first level in original D&D don't have a spell. They don't get their first spell until second level. So the magic user has one up on everybody else. They're going to do the same amount of damage. They're going to get the same attack roll that everybody else gets. And they're going to have an extra goodie on top of that being a spell. And that spell is kind of the balancing factor for them not being able to wear armor. All these things were put into place with this balance. So I know that if you're new to the game, or if you've been playing video games, or you've been playing 5e where, you know, your character starts out with all the spells and knows all the things, and you're like a superhero starting out the gate, the fact that you start with D4, you know, or now in this case, D6 hit points and one spell, a lot of people think that's really limiting. I had someone come into the comments and I talked about the game that I run for my daughter. We're playing this version, the 1981 BX rules, and she and her friend are playing elves. And for a while, there's another elf character until that player moved away. But in here, elves, just like magic users, start with one spell at first level. And I didn't let them pick. I actually rolled randomly. I had them roll, but then I told them what they got. And it wasn't, for all three of them, it wasn't the spell that they necessarily wanted. But one of them got shield. One of them got read magic, which was my daughter's character. And the third character got hold portal. And this person came into the comments and it's like, your game's brutal. Like, you know, your daughter and her friends have a tough road to hoe with you as their DM. Like, one spell's too limiting and all that kind of stuff. Sure. But again, as I always say, limitations invites creativity. So what was so much fun about this is the fact that because I randomly rolled the spells, I didn't know what they were going to get. They didn't know what they were going to get. And finding ways to use these spells in the game has been so much fun, of like when they're going to use it. Like the player that has shield, she's the one, unfortunately, that moved away and doesn't play anymore. But a lot of times the group would figure out like, hey, you should cast shield because you're going to have the best armor class of the group going up against, you know, missile weapons, armor class of 2. And remember, we're doing descending armor class in all editions of TSR era D&D. So lower is better. So an armor class of 2 is the equivalent of plate mail and shield. And so they would, like, if people were firing arrows, they were like, you should be in front, like drawing the attacks, and then the others will flank when people aren't looking, and then we'll come in from the side. Like, they would figure out, but like that character could only cast that spell once per game, so then had to figure out when they were going to cast it. And to me, thinking on your feet and coming up with creative ways and when to use these spells, and that's part of the beauty of the Vancian magic, is this idea that, like, you know, as soon as you cast that spell that you're not going to have it again until you're able to rest and rememorize it. So you have to know the exact moment of when it makes sense to cast that spell. And it created so much tension. And the thing is, my daughter and her friends have never complained about this because they have no context. To them, even knowing one spell is better than not having any. And they've never complained about anything. So anyway, that's just a quick version of how I look at magic. But as we look at the spells in original D&D, or as the magic user, what we're going to see here is I did mention throwing that dagger into combat. It's actually not clear in these rules if that's something that you can do. It doesn't say you can throw the dagger, but it doesn't say that you can't. So you're kind of making a leap of faith. And part of that is based on, I think, a lot of people looking at later editions and knowing where it specifically says that you can throw a dagger, and then assuming that you can throw it in original D&D. Now, it also mentions that because our character has an 18 intelligence, they're going to add 10% to their earned experience. Okay, so that's the same for any character. If their prime requisite, which is strength for fighters, intelligence for magic users, and wisdom for clerics, if that's over 15 in original D&D, you get a plus 10% bonus to your experience points. Okay, now let's get to the spells. and figure out how this works. So this table tells us that a medium, which is a first level magic user by title for original D&D, has one spell of first level at first level. And then it's going to go up to 2 first level spells at second level. And then at third level, you'll have 3 first level spells and 1 second level spell, and so on and so on. So that's the spells that they can cast. However, here's the description. Spells and levels. It says the number above each column is the spell level or complexity, a somewhat subjective determination on the part of your authors. The number in each column opposite each applicable character indicates the number of spells of each level that can be used. And in the parentheses, it says, remembered during any single adventure. And then end of parentheses, by that character. Spells are listed and explained later. A spell used once may not be remembered or may not be reused in the same day. So a few things here. One of the things, and this is constant with original D&D, is the part where it says, is the number of spells that can be used, and it says remembered during any single adventure. It never tells you what constitutes an adventure. Is an adventure one game session? What if that game session lasts for more than one day within real game time? Now, usually, you've heard me before. I did a whole video recently on the forgotten rules that actually made D&D better. And I talked about the real world, or the 1-for-1 time, which is that for each hour that passed in the real world, an hour passed in the game world. Well, that was only when you weren't in the dungeon, right? So when you were playing, that time was not kept that way, because then it would be impossible to actually adventure. So a lot of times, like, you would say, I'm traveling, and then you would mark off how much time had passed, and then you would move forward. So what is an adventure? Again, is it a single game session? Is it what the DM decides is an adventure? Is it a single delve into a dungeon level and then coming back to town? Like, that's never described. So it says that they can remember is the number of spells each level that can be remembered during a single adventure by that character. And then it says, once you cast it, it's gone, and you can't use it again in the same day. So the implication from the way this is written then, because it never tells you otherwise, is that a first level character knows all of these spells. They're all usable by the character, but then the character has to decide for that specific adventure, however we're going to define the time limit of what an adventure is, they have to decide which spell to pick, and that's the only one that they can use. And then it says it can only be remembered during that once it's cast, it can't be cast again in the same day. So then the implication is you would have to rememorize it the next day. So it's not clear. It's very ambiguous, because, again, if an adventure is covering more than one day of game time, maybe an adventure is a week. Does that mean that the character, let's say, picks, of all these spells that they know, when they start out, maybe they pick sleep? And does that mean that sleep is the only spell that they will ever be able to cast during that adventure, which again could cover more than a single day, so that if they cast it on day one, the next day they can decide to rememorize it, but they can only decide to rememorize sleep because that was the spell that they decided to learn for that adventure. So the wording on this is very, very ambiguous, and it's vague, and it created a lot of confusion with a lot of people, and rightly so. So I do think that there's, if you look at later editions, there's this idea of spell books, and the idea that your spell books are big and heavy, and they carry all of your spells, or they hold all of your spells, but you're not bringing them with you into the dungeon because they're big and heavy and bulky. And also, you don't want to lose them, if you get captured or whatever might happen. So there's this kind of thought, and I think that you can bake it into this description of like learning one spell per adventure. This idea that like you're leaving your spell books in a secret hidden location where nobody can get to them. And you're deciding as you go onto that adventure, what are the spells, or which spell, whatever it is, am I going to need based on the research that I've done? We've learned rumors. We know what we're coming up against. We've heard that there's goblins there. We've heard that there's a dragon there, whatever it is. And so then you go through your entire list and you go, these are the ones that I'm going to need. And you commit those into memory. And then you go off on your adventure, but you leave your spell books behind. It doesn't say you do that in here at all, but there is a little bit, again, if you look at later editions, it looks like that might have been the intent for this, but you might have done it differently. And I would love to hear from folks and how you interpreted what that means. But we see our list of spells here by level. And it's interesting because there's not the same number per level. There's only 8 first level spells. And you'll notice that the probably most iconic first level spell for a magic user, which is Magic Missile, is not on this list. That's because that spell hadn't been invented yet. You'll see the second level spells. There are 10 of them. However, there are 14 third level spells, 12 fourth level spells. There are 14 fifth level spells, and there are 12 sixth level spells. And it stops there because at this point in time, magic user spells only went up to 6th level. So there were no 7th, 8th, or 9th level spells. That's going to come later. Okay. So the spell books, it's going to tell us in here, you have 1 spell book per level of spells. So if you are high enough level to be able to cast 5th level spells, you have 5 spell books, 1 for each level of spells. This is why you don't bring them with you into the dungeon. Okay, because it would be like physically impossible. You'd have to bring like a wagon or something. It's going to make a lot of noise. It's not going to move up and down the stair. Like, however you're going to carry these things. So, but again, the implication in here is that you know all the spells. Once you're able to cast spells of that level, you are able to pick any of the ones that you want to cast for that particular adventure. There's nothing in here about how to learn spells. So that is our first level magic user. Now, a couple other things we talked about, those ability scores that I rolled. Okay, so in original D&D, the strength of 11 is not going to make any impact on their fighting capability at all. And that is going to hold true for every edition here, just because it's 11. Now, an 11 in here also makes no difference for a fighter, but even an 18 for this would make no difference for a fighter. I already talked about strength doesn't impact anything for a fighter other than giving them a bonus to their experience points if it's high, or a penalty if it's low. And so we'll get to that, but across the board, that strength of 11 is going to be irrelevant, as is the wisdom of 9. So wisdom in here also does nothing in original D&D, but not just because it's a 9, just because it doesn't do anything. But later on, when they start adding bonuses and penalties for every ability based on your score, that 9 is going to be irrelevant because it's an average score, so it doesn't matter. And that's going to be the same thing with Constitution. Now, Constitution in here does give you a bonus to your hit points if it's high enough. However, our character has a constitution of 12, and that's not going to be quite high enough to make any kind of difference. In order to get a hit point bonus, we needed to have a constitution of 15 or more, and then we could have added 1 to each hit die. But our character only has a constitution of 12. Now, the dexterity of 17, we already talked about that we're going to get +1 to our missile fire. That's all that the dexterity is going to do for us. And then the charisma of 8 is going to tell us that we have a maximum of 3 henchmen or hirelings that we can have, and that their loyalty base it makes no difference. So there's no bonus, but there's no penalty. That's how those ability scores affect it. And that is the original D&D magic user. Let's move on to Greyhawk and see what happens in this one. So we're going to see quite a few changes in here that are going to start to become familiar in later editions of D&D. As I always say, Greyhawk is the book that really starts to change original D&D from its vagueness and its open-endedness and gets it closer to the versions of D&D that come in later years. So in this particular one, again, I'm just going to focus on the things that are relevant to our magic users. So I'm not going to really talk about any of the other ability scores. I'm going to focus on the intelligence. And what the intelligence here is going to tell us, very interestingly, is there's going to be this table here that shows us chance to know each given spell and the minimum and maximum number of spells per level. So this is a brand new thing that's introduced in Greyhawk, and this is going to come right into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But it says intelligence is not only the prime requisite for magical types, but it also delineates how many spells they can and may know and learn. This is indicated on the table. So our character with an intelligence of 18 has a 95% chance to know any given spell, and their minimum number of spells per level is 8. So if you saw before the magic user table of first level spells, there was only 8 on there. So this would mean that magic user would know all 8 of those spells. Now that spell list is going to expand here in Greyhawk to go beyond 8, but that's kind of what that means. And then the maximum number of spells per level tells you, well, at what point do you stop learning spells at that level? Well, our intelligence of 18 is going to say never. We are going to know all the spells at every level. So your chance to know any given spell is 95%, and your minimum number is 8. So the way that this works is that you're going to have these spells in your spell book, and it's going to tell you that you're going to roll to see which one of those spells that you know. Now, with a 95% chance, obviously, it's a pretty good chance that we're going to know all of them, but you sort of roll them in order. And if you roll 96 or above, that means you don't know that spell and it doesn't go into your book. Okay. And the only thing that's going to change that, I believe, is if your intelligence score moves up or down. Okay. So this is also going to tell us that intelligence of certain scores is necessary to cast certain level of spells. So you need an intelligence of 11 to employ 6th level spells and an intelligence of 17 to employ 9th level spells. So we know our minimum number of spells. So the way that you do this, again, is you roll until you reach your minimum. So you're rolling that 95% or under. And if you get that, then you know that spell. But once you hit 8, you stop. That's how that's supposed to work. And then as you're adventuring, if you encounter new spells and you haven't reached your maximum, so there's more than 8 first level spells or 8 first level spells in Greyhawk, it expands it. We'll see that in a second. So then as you encounter these new spells, then you get to roll and add them to your book if you make your roll, which chances are you're going to. Okay, so it's kind of trying to cut back a little bit on the power of the magic users and also reward ability scores. Greyhawk is when we start to see that ability scores start to matter much more so than they did in original D&D. So we're rolling for that. Greyhawk is also going to change the hit points for our magic user. So magic users in this case are going to change from a D6 hit die to a D4. So this is Greyhawk is where we start to see different hit die for different character classes. So the average for our character is going to move from 3.5 of on a die 6 to 2.5 on a die 4, and it's going to remain that way for the rest of all of the TSR era editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So they have lost some hit points. Okay, and again, they're not getting that Constitution bonus. And now also what's going to happen in here is this is going to add the idea that different weapons do different kinds of damage. And so it's an optional rule. It says addition, but a dagger now, instead of doing D6, is going to do 1D4. So the magic user has lost combat efficacy as well, because they've moved from having 3.5 hit points on average and doing 3.5 points of damage on average. Well, now they have 2.5 hit points on average, and they're going to do 2.5 hit points of damage with their dagger. Okay, so that definitely is bumping them down, and that was done at the expense of trying to make fighters better. Okay, and I have a whole video on why Gary Gygax preferred fighters, and it might sound interesting because his most famous character is probably Mordenkainen, which is a magic user. But he has on record, and I talk all about it in that video, that he really thought, and it's based on the kind of fiction that he read growing up that showed big muscle-bound heroes fighting demons and sorcerers on pulp magazine covers or pulp book covers and rescuing the damsel in distress. And he thought everyone would want to play the thick muscle-bound hero, not the skinny wimpy sorcerer who's being sliced in half with a sword or like whatever. So a lot of the rules that are written in here that make magic users weak were done on purpose. Also, people had learned to start exploiting these rules and figuring out creative uses for spells. And so Gary's trying to kind of backtrack and keep magic users from running away with the game. Okay, so we have our minimum spells per level that we talked about. And those are going to be like the main changes in here. So I talked about the changes in hit points and the dagger damage and all that kind of stuff. But the main thing that's going to happen here, we were going to look at the spells, is looking at, how many spells that they might be able to cast and checking to see if you can learn that new spell. So here's our spell tables. It's broken into 2 pages, which is difficult. But so our first level spells are going to move from a total of 8 spells to 11. And the 3 new spells introduced here are Shield, Magic Missile, and Ventriloquism. Our second level spells are going to expand up to 16. And our third level spells are going to expand up to 18. So you see, and it's a lot of the spells that you see, anything with an asterisk is a new spell in here. Some of these are like very iconic spells, obviously Magic Missile, Shield, but also stuff like web or mirror image, magic mouth, rope trick, monster summoning. All the monster summoning spells were new in here. So those are all introduced in Greyhawk, as well as 7th, 8th, and 9th level spells, which didn't exist before. Okay, so that's our look at the Greyhawk changes that are made to the Magic User. But let's move forward and talk about the Holmes edition of D&D. So as a reminder, this is edited by Professor Holmes, and it is intended, its original intent was to be a cleaned up version of original D&D with some info from the supplements, particularly from Greyhawk using the Thief class, and rewriting it to be clearer and easier to understand for players who weren't familiar with war games. And it only covers levels 1 through 3. Now, post-writing but pre-publication, the editors at TSR are going to decide that this is actually being written as an introduction to advanced D&D, which is a whole mess. But the short version of this is that it's going to kind of go backwards and pedal back from a lot of those changes to the ability scores made in Greyhawk. So the whole bit in here of like, you are going to get your experience point bonus for having a 15 or more in our intelligence, but there's no strength bonus for fighters for fighting. There's no dexterity bonus for our high dexterity. Now in Greyhawk, fighters can get an armor class bonus for their dexterity, but only fighters. And so our magic user with that dexterity of 17 wouldn't have had an impact in Greyhawk rules because they're not fighters. Okay, but that's completely missing here. Now they are going to get a +1 to fire missiles for that high dexterity. And then again, for Constitution, we need to have a 15 or a 16 to add 1 to each die. And then it's going to actually scale. But we only have a 12, so our Constitution isn't going to impact that. So what's going to happen here is it tells us that magic users are humans who elect to become magic users, must not wear any armor, and can only carry a dagger for protection. They can, however, use almost all magical items, but not magical swords and other magical arms other than daggers. They have the advantage shared with clerics and some elves of being able to work magical spells. At the start, however, they can cast only one spell, and they must advance a level in experience before they can learn another. So that wording is very specific here. This is different. It says they know one spell, but they have to advance a level before they learn another spell, not cast another spell. So in original D&D, the implication is they actually know all the spells, but they have to pick which one they're going to cast on each individual adventure. This writing makes it seem that they actually only know one spell, period, and they have to wait until they advance in level, and then they're going to learn another spell. So it's a very different way of playing because now you are being a little bit more limited. But this is the way I grew up playing. So this idea of like, you don't know all the spells and get to pick from them. You only know the one spell. So, and it says, thus the magic user starts out as an extremely weak character, but if he survives and rises in experience, he becomes increasingly powerful. The types of spells and the way they are used were discussed in a later section. Magic users, of course, may be either good or evil, lawful or chaotic, and most of their spells remain the same. So now, one of the other things that's in here, and we can talk about that now, it's this limitation of magic users using only daggers. So why is that in the game? And, a lot of people go, well, Elric used a sword and Gandalf used a sword, and those are magic users. And so if Gandalf used a sword, why can't the D&D magic user use a sword? Well, for one thing, it's because D&D is not Tolkien. So I always find it funny when people try to pick out the one specific work of fiction that they like and then imply that that should be the standard. So, of course, Tolkien was, very famous at the time, but it is one of a gazillion different influences into the game of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So one of it is that Dungeons and Dragons was not intended to replicate how to play Lord of the Rings as a game. Lord of the Rings was an influence. It's not the only influence. So to pick out Gandalf using a sword and imply that that should have become the standard for the magic users is a little disingenuous on my mind. Now, the other part of it is, of course, there is some kind of fictional resources that we can look to, especially the pulp stories that Gygax read, like the Conan stories, very specifically, where, and this, you see this also throughout like history when people are talking about like this idea of like magical rites and sacrifices and all this kind of stuff, this idea of these evil sorcerers using daggers in their magical rites, their eldritch rites. And the dagger becomes kind of this like ceremonial weapon. And so there is a tie there from a fictional in-world standpoint of it would make sense for the magic user to use a dagger. Again, that's from a story-based element, okay? Now, a lot of people said, well, why can't they also use the staff? Well, for one thing, the staff is not listed here in the list of weapons for original D&D. Okay, it's going to come into the game later in other editions. And so you would think, well, once they add the staff, that makes sense because, you know, a magic user leaning on his staff, walking with the staff, that's a very iconic image. Well, from a combat standpoint, the idea is that magic users aren't supposed to be good at combat, and stabbing somebody with the pointy end of a dagger takes much less training than learning how to wield a quarterstaff, which they are pretty heavy. These are not light things. A dagger is quite light and it could be wielded one-handed. And as we've talked about, in theory, although it doesn't specifically say you can do it, it could be thrown from a distance to keep the magic user safe from at least a little bit away. Okay, and but the quarterstaff, as I understand it, is that it does require a little bit more training to learn how to wield a quarterstaff effectively to both parry blows and to land blows. And the magic user is not spending their time learning how to fight. They're spending their time learning how to cast spells. So that's another thematic element of why originally a staff might not been listed among the weapons that a magic user can use, in addition to the fact that it's not even listed as a weapon in the original Dungeons and Dragons rulebook, a list of equipment and weapons. Okay, and then thirdly, there is the game design element to this. So this is the thing. A lot of people don't like this, but it does. And when I say this, I mean this idea that like game balance or game effects or whatever you want to call it, the mechanics of the game can impact the way that something is perceived within the game world. So magic users can only use magic daggers partially because magic daggers show up far less frequently on the list of treasures that you might roll of magic weapons than any other type of weapon that's on there. Okay, so what I mean by that is that originally when you had a treasure hoard in original D&D or any of these early TSR versions of D&D. So here's the table from Greyhawk, and you see there's a whole table for figuring out what kind of swords that you're going to get. All these different swords that you can roll on this table. So that's one table. But then you have another table of miscellaneous weapons. You've got magic arrows and magic crossbow bolts. Well, you see the dagger here. There's two different kinds of magic daggers. Okay, and they are on a scale of 35 to 50 on a roll of D100. Okay, and that's it. So a 15% chance or 16%, whatever that is, versus all of these other weapons on here that a fighter could use. And then a few of them that a cleric could use. Mace of Disruption, the Warhammers. There's several different Warhammers. But that's it for the magic user. And then the fighter can use any of these. Well, that's deliberate. That's game design balance. Because the idea is if the DM rolled on these tables and found a weapon, chances are it's going to be a weapon that only a fighter can use. And that is a game balance part of the fighter's class ability, that they can pick up any magic weapon and use it. Okay. The magic user has to wait around for the dagger to show up on the table and be put into the magic hoard and then convince the fighter that they should get the magic dagger, right? Because they're also probably magic users getting all these other magic items that the fighter can't use, different wands and staves, and there's scrolls and there's all this kind of stuff that like fighters can't use. So that's part of game design balance. So that is a big reason why magic users can only use daggers. Okay, it could have been any weapon, I guess, but they picked daggers, and again, from the thematic aspect to it. Now, this magic user, like all of our other magic users so far, is going to have an AC of 9 because they have no armor, and 9 was the worst that you can get in this version of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, now, when we get to our spells, we are going to use a table that is pretty much lifted out of Greyhawk of the intelligence to tell us the percent chance that we're going to know a spell at any given level, which is going to be 95%. Our minimum spells per level is 8, and our maximum is all. We're going to know all the spells. We have the chance to know all of the spells if we roll correctly. There's no maximum. Okay, so that is something that is retained from Greyhawk as far as the different ability scores. That's one of the few that's actually retained because Greyhawk, again, really expands the usefulness of the different ability scores. Now, here's some interesting stuff that it's going to say here. in the home section. It says a first level magic user, and then in parentheses medium, or a second level cleric adept may cast one spell, and as they go up in experience points, the number of spells increases. The magic user acquires books containing the spells, the study of which allows him to memorize a spell for use. He can throw the spell. He can then throw the spell by saying the magic words and making gestures with his hands. That's the first time we've seen that anywhere. We haven't seen in original D&D or in Greyhawk or anything where it talks about you have to do gestures and all this kind of stuff to cast spells. It just says you cast the spell, right? It doesn't tell you how. And it says this means that a magic user bound and gagged cannot use his magic. So that's interesting. And this is probably something that's come up during play where players have figured this out to be clever during a game. And then they decided that they wanted to add this into the rules that if you bind and gag a magic user, you're basically taking away their ability to cast spells. In some cases, the spell may require substances or apparatus, such as conjuring a water elemental requires the presence of water, or a sleep spell requires a pinch of sand. A magic user must concentrate on a spell, so he cannot cast a spell and walk or run at the same time. And he can certainly not cast a spell while engaged in combat. Then after all that, the spell may not work. And it says, most important, as the spell is recited, it fades from the magic user's mind and he cannot use it again. He must go back to his study and relearn the spell. Now, in this case, it's going to tell us that it takes at least 1 day to relearn the spell. So, in other versions, they're going to shorten that quite a bit. But Holmes is going to say you need a whole day to rememorize all the spells that you know. Magic users cannot bring their magic books into the dungeon with them. Now it's going to tell us very specifically you can't do that. Always assume that more than 1 day has passed between expeditions so that a magic user who leaves the dungeon and goes home may start a new game with all his spells ready, but the appropriate time log must be carefully noted. So that again goes back to that idea I was talking about of like the 1-for-1 time. In original D&D gameplay, the way that you played was you didn't end a session in the middle of a dungeon, because remember, once the session ends and until the next session starts, the amount of time that passes in the real world was going to pass in the dungeon. And you did not want to be stuck in the middle of a dungeon surrounded by monsters and have to fortify your room and hope that your supplies don't run out before you're able to play again. So you always tried to end the session out of the dungeon, and at least at the bare minimum, you're on your way back to town, if not, you haven't gotten back into town. That's the home base idea. And so that's what this is talking about, this idea that like, assume that the magic users had enough time between sessions then to rememorize all the spells that they know, but then you have to know how much time's actually passed so that you don't forget to keep track of like, you needed so many days to rememorize all of your spells. Okay, so this is getting a lot more specific and I would say a little bit more restrictive in terms of how spellcasting is handled in Holmes. Okay, and that says this rule places great limitations on the magic user's power. There are ways to partially overcome them. One is to have the spell written out on a magic scroll. Scrolls are written in magic runes that fade from the page as they are read. So a scroll can only be used once. Magic users may take a scroll of a spell they already know, that is, have in their spell book or magic book, at a cost of 100 gold pieces and 1 week's worth for each spell of first level, 2,000 or 200 gold pieces and 2 weeks for second level spell if the magic user is third level, etc. So this is another thing that's going to be part of this, is that you can create your own scrolls, and that way you don't have to worry about how many spells you've memorized. As long as you've created your scrolls ahead of time, you can cast them off the scroll. Of course, once you cast it from the scroll, it's gone off the scroll, so you'd have to prepare, as many as you can. And then it says certain magic items which can be found in the dungeon can only be used by magic users, and often only by magic users. Wands, staves, rings, amulets, potions, scrolls, and similar items. And that's part of their class balance ability, because they have so few spells, but they're able to use a lot more magic items than any of the other classes. And it says that they can create new spells, and it goes through the details on how you can research new spells. So this is a big thing. People don't seem to do this as much anymore in new versions of Dungeons and Dragons or in modern games or whatever. But originally, doing spell research was a big thing for characters. And so a lot of the classic spells, and I'll as an example, one of them is Drawmage's Instant Summons, I think it is. So Drawmage was the name of Jim Ward's magic user character. And his character, he created that spell in the game to solve a need that he needed. He had to ask Gary. Gary was his dungeon master. He said, I need to do this. Can I create the spell that does this? And Gary said yes. And that spell is now one of the more iconic spells that's come into Dungeons and Dragons. And it got created by a player during a game to serve a need. But I just feel like people just don't do that as much anymore. Okay, and so it talks about creating the spells and spell research, and then it talks about the number of spells a magic user may employ during an adventure is determined by what level the magic user may be. If he's first level, only one. He gets to choose the spell he will memorize from his books, and he does this before the expedition starts off. So now it's implying that you might have more than one spell in your book, but it doesn't really get into how many spells are going to be in your book and how do you put them in there. All right, so now it's going to give us the example, finally. Says, let us suppose that old Malcor, the first level magic user, is planning on going on a dangerous quest. His intelligence is only 10, and he cannot have studied and copied into his books all the spells listed under the Book of First Level Spells. And it says this list is given later. That's just a spell list by level. And it says the most he can have available is 6. That's based on his intelligence, which is 10. So his max spells is 6. His minimum known is 4. And it says, and at least 4. The game player would like to give him the sleep spell. His chance to know this spell, have it available in his books, is 50%. And then that's from this table again. It shows you that an intelligence of 10, he has 50% chance to know any given spell. Have it available in his books. Okay, so 2 20-sided die are rolled. So it's telling you how to roll 20-sided die to calculate the percentage. But basically, you just have to, he's got a 50% chance. And he says, so if it's 51 or above, he's not going to know the spell, and poor Malcor must try for another spell. Incidentally, if he goes through the entire list without getting his minimum of 4 spells, he gets to try again. So you go all the way through, and if you don't hit your minimum of 4, then you start over and start rolling again to see which ones you learn. And it says, but being a first level magic user, he can only memorize 1 spell. So it's getting a little bit more specific now. He's probably going to have a minimum of 4 spells in his spell book based on his intelligence of 10, but he's only going to know 1 spell that he can cast on a specific adventure. Further studying experience with magic expands his ability, and when he reaches 2nd level, he can carry 2 spells in his head. Okay, so that's going to be the gist of the Holmes version of the magic user. Now, as far as the dagger use, we're going back to every weapon doing d6 damage. So his dagger is now going to do an average of 3.5 points of damage. And, we talked about the experience point bonus that he's going to get. So in all other respects, he's pretty much very close to the original D&D spellcaster. Now, instead of going chronologically by time, I'm going to stick with this line of Dungeons and Dragons that, at the time when I was a kid, we just called it basic D&D. It was technically just called Dungeons and Dragons, and that was to distinguish it from advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm going to stick with this, but this version is the one I started with. This is the Moldvay Cook Marsh or BX version of D&D from 1981. So I'm just going to talk about some of the big changes that are going to come in here. So the first thing that's going to happen is that, and I talked about this before a couple of times, but the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition of Dungeons & Dragons is the first one that is going to unify the bonuses and penalties of ability scores so that you don't have this weird mishmash of like which score means which bonus or penalty. So everything is going to be on this table of a 3 gives you a -3 penalty, a 4 to 5 gives you a -2, a 6 to 8 gives you a -1, a 9 to 12 gives you no adjustment, a 13 to 15 gives you a +1, a 16 to 17 gives you a +2, and an 18 gives you a +3. And that's across the board for all of these. There's a couple little hiccups in here, such as the initiative adjustment, which is optional anyway for dexterity, doesn't follow that pattern. And then the maximum number of henchmen and their adjustment to the reaction is not based on that. The adjustment to reaction is a little bit different. But other than that, it's going to stick on that pattern. And what this means is that also this character with an intelligence of 18 can read and write all of their native languages, and they get to add +3 languages to the languages that they know. So that's how the intelligence is going to impact this particular magic using character. And the only other ability score that we have that's high is that dexterity of 17 that I rolled. Well, that's going to give us +2 to hit on our hit rolls for missile fire. And it's going to give us a -2 bonus, because remember, lower is better, for our armor class. So this magic user will have an armor class of 7 to start out. So no armor is 9, and then -2 for their dexterity gives us a 7 armor class, which would be the equivalent of roughly about 12. The math doesn't quite work out. It works out better if the base of no armor is 10, which is going to be advanced D&D. The basic system gets a little quirky, but in any event, they're adding +2 to their armor, or -2, however you want to look at it. Okay. Now, in this particular one, they are going to get plus 10% for having an ability score of 18 in their prime requisite. Okay, so that's going to be consistent. The dagger's still going to do d6 damage, so a lot of people forget about this. There is an optional system in Moldvay BX, which is the one that most people use, is the optional one, where weapons can have variable weapon damage, but the default in here is that all weapons do d6 points of damage. So the dagger would do d6 unless you're using the variable weapon damage. Okay, now in the description of magic, it's going to tell us that magic is based on words and gestures once again. So they're really getting into this idea that you have to say the spell out loud, and you have to have free use of your hands or body to like cast the spell. So that's another thing that's going to be in here. Okay, and it's going to tell us that it's only going to take 1 hour to rememorize our spell after we've cast it. So it says spells must be memorized before an adventure begins. The character will remember the spell for any length of time until it is used. When a magic user, elf, or cleric memorizes a spell, the words and gestures are printed on their mind. And this is what I was talking about, like writing on the blackboard. It says that very specifically. And then it says when the spell is cast, the writing is erased, and he or she may not cast that particular spell again. And then it says, but if you have enough spells, you're able to cast enough spells per day, you could prepare the same spell twice. And so when you cast it once, the other use is still there. So they're trying to make sure that you know that, like, if you wanted to cast Magic Missile twice, you just prepare it twice. And once you've cast it the first time, the other one is still in your brain because it was a different way of memorizing it. Okay. And then it says you increase in level, the number of type of spells you can memorize increase. And then it says, most adventures should not take more than a few hours of game time. However, if an adventure lasts longer than a day, a character may rememorize erased spells, which are spells that are already cast, once a day. First, the character must be well rested, usually an uninterrupted full night's sleep. Then, by spending an hour of character time undisturbed, the spellcaster of levels 1 through 3 may memorize all of his or her erased spells. So it talks about the bit, like if you can't talk or if you use hand motions, like if you're bound and gagged, you can't cast a spell. And it says, similarly, because the words and gestures must be repeated exactly, spells cannot be cast while performing any other actions such as walking or fighting. Okay, and then it talks about applying saving throws and all that kind of stuff. Now, in original D&D, in Moldvay Basic here, it's going to tell us that magic users and elves may use only one spell at first level. And then it says, unlike clerics, magic users and elves must select the spells to be used from the spells that they know. These spells are stored in large spell books. As magic users and elves gain levels of experience, the number of spells they may use also increases. And then it says, each magic user and elf has a spell book for the spells that he or she has learned. Really quickly, if you're not familiar with this version of D&D, this is the first version of D&D, this one, the 1981 Moldvay Cookmarsh BX version, where elf, dwarf, and halfling are classes, not races. So an elf is a class, and it acts as essentially a multi-class fighter magic user. Okay, so that's why they keep saying elf or magic user, because the elf is essentially operating as a magic user, but can also wear armor and fight and use swords. Okay. But it says a first level character will only have one spell, a first level spell in the spell book. So this doesn't use that intelligence table from Greyhawk or even from Holmes edition of D&D to figure out how many spells you might know, and then you get to select which ones you're going to cast. In this one, as a first level character, you only know one spell from your spell book, and that's it. That's all that's in there. And there really are no rules in here for adding, like finding a scroll and copying it into your spell book. It's one of the things that people complain about, and that they house rule a lot in Moldvay BX and other versions of D&D. If you come across a scroll and you have read magic available so you can read the scroll, well, you've read the scroll, but if you don't cast it, you can then copy it into your spell book, and that way you have it forevermore after that, and you can always go back to it and try to cast it, or learn it, memorize it, and then cast it. Moldvay BX doesn't have mechanics for doing that. So, for example, my daughter's character, she's an elf, and her first level spell, I think I mentioned, was Read Magic, her very first one. And so as a DM, I knew it was incumbent on me to make sure that I was giving her the opportunity to use scrolls, to find scrolls in the game, because that was the way that her Read Magic spell was going to be effective. And so A lot of that is on the onus of the DM to kind of like make that work. And but also, she didn't copy those spells into her spell book because again, there's no mechanics for doing that in here. So this one is again a little bit more limiting. But again, because we have now they're going to have D4 hit points, so they are going to be weaker as far as like on the defensive range, but that they're going to get that dexterity bonus to their armor class, so they're a little bit harder to hit. And then if they do use their dagger, again, they're going to get that +2 bonus from their dexterity for missile fire. So maybe they're throwing their dagger from a distance, staying out of harm's way, and that dagger's going to do 1d6 points of damage. So it can probably take out a first level monster, hopefully with a good die roll, right? So I wouldn't say that they're, people are always of this impression that like once the magic user casts their spell, they're useless for the rest of the adventure. And I just think that is such a limited way to look at this. And people go, well, the fighter gets to keep swinging his sword. Yeah, he does. But the thing is, again, in all these versions of D&D that we're talking about so far, the fighter isn't any better at fighting than any other character. Now, as you move on, it's maybe your fighter has a high strength and then they get to use that bonus for strength when they're attacking to their attack roll and their damage. But it's not guaranteed because you're rolling your ability scores in order with 3d6 down the line. So your fighter might have a strength of 10 and get no bonus or worse, right? So there's no guarantee that your fighter is going to have a strength bonus to attack. And if they don't, they're no better at attacking than a magic user is with attacking. And if you're using the default rules in here where every weapon does d6, that means they're also not going to do any more damage than anybody has. So once again, going back to what I talked about in original D&D, that the only benefit that fighter's getting is that they have armor and the magic user doesn't. But if the magic user stays at a distance and, like I said, throws their dagger as opposed to getting to melee, they have a pretty good chance of surviving and contributing to the party. And the contribution shouldn't be thought of as just what's in combat. It's another thing that people tend to do with Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of it comes from the video game mindset, which is that D&D is a combat-oriented game, and if you're not contributing to combat, then you're not contributing. And because there's no skill systems in these games, there's no, what is the magic user supposed to do once they've cast their spell? Anything they want, whatever the character comes up with. So I mentioned in my game, and yeah, they're elves, so they can fight a little bit. They have swords and armor. But in my daughter's game, like the fighting is very minimal. They tend to run or try to talk their way out of combat. They don't like fighting because it's a gamble, it's a risk, and they're expending resources in terms of hit points and spells if they cast spell or whatever it is in a combat. So they tend to try to avoid combat. And so then that means that every character is contributing equally because it all becomes about role playing and how they want to role play their character and what they think that character brings to the table. And they bring in their background, which is emerged during play. It wasn't a 12-page backstory written before the game started. The background of their characters has emerged during play as I've asked them questions like, who grew up in the forest? And the first player that raises their hand and says, oh, I did because this, and then they'll tell me a quick story and say, okay, cool. And then I'll give them like a reason to use skills that they might have learned growing up in the forest or growing up on a farm or whatever it was that might be relevant to that particular adventure, right? And also the players will bring things in. Like one of the times in the game that I run for my daughter, they were trying to impress somebody. And so my daughter's character said, so my daughter's character's name is Cora, Netflix, that's her elf's name. And the other elf's name is Holly Short. And they decided that they were from this town called Wibbleville, which is not something I'd created for my campaign world. They just wanted to be from there. And so in one of the adventures, they were trying to impress somebody in a village because they were trying to get a meeting with somebody. And so my daughter said, she's like, can Cora and Holly show this guy a native dance from Wibbleville that they've probably never ever seen? Because we don't see any other elves in this town. So they've probably never seen something like this. And she was just talking off the cuff. And I was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's do that. And so she described how the dance went. And my point is anybody could do that. So the fact that she didn't cast a spell or fight didn't mean she wasn't contributing. And I think people just get so focused on once the magic users cast their spell, they're useless and can't do anything. And that is a very, very limited way of looking at how to play Dungeons and Dragons. But again, that's just what I think. And I would love to hear what you think, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that disagree with that. Okay, so that's basically the gist of what we're going to see in the Moldvay version of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, in the expert set, which covers levels 4 through 14, the one thing that they're going to add to the magic users so that we know what they're capable of doing here, it says they can add more spells to their spell books through spell research at 9th level and above, which 9th level in this version is the wizard title. Magic users may also create magical items. Both of these activities are explained under magical research. I'm not going to get into that, but that's in there. And then it says upon reaching 11th level, they can choose to build a tower, provided that money to pay for the tower is available. And then it says the magic user who constructs the tower will gain 1d6 apprentices of levels 1 through 3. So that's another key part of these original versions of Dungeons and Dragons, is this idea of this kind of end game, which was that you were going to create a wizard tower or a stronghold if you're a fighter, or a stronghold or temple if you're a cleric, or a hideout or guild if you're a thief, and you're going to attract all these followers that live there. And then at that point, it was kind of expected that you were probably going to retire your character and start a new one because you'd reached this end game to defend this territory. Okay, so that is the BX version of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the BECMI version, so this covers levels 1 through 14. And they were supposed to do another book that covered levels 15 plus, and that never came out. And instead, they revised it for the BECMI edition. And I talk all about why that was. Only 2 years later, they scrapped this version, the Moldvay Cook Marsh BX, and they come up with an entirely new version called BECMI. And my understanding is from talking to a few folks that Gary hired Frank Metzner to do this, or appointed him to do this. Frank Metzner was already working there. But he put Frank Metzner in charge with the idea of changing this game, and Frank Metzner hardly changes it at all. What changes is the marketing and the layout and the consistency of the trade dress and all that kind of stuff. And so I did a whole video where I talked about the impacts of that. But rules-wise, this is almost identical. So at a basic level, for first level character, everything I just talked about for Moldvay is going to apply to a magic user from the BECMI version of basic. What is going to change later on is that eventually the BECMI version, so basic is the B, levels 1 through 3, expert is the E for levels 4 through 14. Then the companion set, the C, covers levels 15 through 25. And in the companion set, it tells us that a magic user of a certain level or higher can choose to become an independent magic user who is a landowner. So getting into that land management that we talked about. And it said that they can be independent and build their own tower, or seize one and take it over and run that tower. Or they can become something known as a magist. And essentially, they're working for someone else who owns a tower or some kind of stronghold or something, and they become like an advisor to them. So they're not the landowner, but they're kind of operating in that way because they're living on a land and sort of holding political power. Okay. Or they can become a traveling magic user at higher level and not be bound to a tower. And those are known as a magus. And the thing is, they don't really get any bonuses. So there's really no reason to do that if you wanted to be a landowner. But of course, being a landowner does sort of limit your adventuring capabilities. Okay. So that's going to be what happens in the companion set. And then in the master set, which covers levels 26 through 36, that's the M of the BECMI sets. In that version of the BECMI edition, it's going to expand the list of weapons available for a magic user for the first time in this line of D&D. And it's going to say that they can also use, in addition to the dagger, they can use blowguns, nets, whips, and staves. So those weapons are going to come in, and it explains all about the rules in that. So that's where we get a little bit of expansion into the weapons for original D&D and the BECMI line, okay, and the basic line, the non-advanced line of D&D. And that's where I'm going to stop with this. The rules cyclopedia comes later, and the easy to master, the black box, and the classic D&D set, but all those are sort of built on the BECMI chassis of rules. And so they're all very, very similar. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Before we continue with first edition AD&D and our look at magic users, I wanted to say that if you are looking for ways that you can support the Daddy Roll to One channel, there are three main ways that you can do that right now. The first is by becoming a super fan and joining this list of other great folks who have had the opportunity and the means to contribute to the channel by hitting that little heart icon with the $sign in it to thank me for the time and effort and research that goes into making these videos. And I really appreciate everyone who becomes a super fan. And if you do so, you'll get your name listed here in a future video. I'd also like to say that you can buy some merchandise from Daddy Roll to One. You can buy t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and tote bags at my spread shop. Or if you're looking for paper good items like stickers, posters, and notebooks with either blank, lined, or graph paper inside, you can buy those at my Redbubble shop. These are all exclusive designs to Daddy Roll to One. And in particular, I think the dice pattern designs look really nice on a poster that you could put like in a game room or somewhere else in your house where you play tabletop role-playing games. And then the third thing that you can do is to buy my supplement that I wrote for old school D&D compatible games like the TSR era of versions of D&D that we've been talking about in the video today. And that is Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. And as you see here, it's a complete handbook to expert characters for old school fantasy role-playing games. It's got 15 different backgrounds for characters to kind of tweak the existing classes and turn them into, expert type archetypes. It's got dozens of random tables for each of those backgrounds. It's got 3 new character classes, Alchemists, Demolitionists, and Inventors. It's got pages of new equipment. It's got a 3-story guild hall with NPCs, rumors, secrets, adventure hooks, and more. You could use that as a base of operations for expert characters or just a place to explore during a campaign, and lots of advice for running expert-themed campaigns. It's a 48-page book. It's available in either a parchment color background or plain white, if that's easier for you to read. And it's also available as a PDF or as a soft cover print-on-demand book. And you can get that at Drive-Thru RPG. I'll put links to that in the show notes below. And thank you so much for your support. All right, so let's get back to looking at the magic user, and we're going to go a little bit back in time. So, the BECMI edition of D&D came out in 1983, but we're going to go back to 1978 and the release of the Player's Handbook for Advanced D&D. And so this is the first, the first book for Advanced D&D was the Monster Manual in 1977, but this is 1978 where we first start to see some of the rules. And so in this version of D&D, let's look at how our magic user is going to differ in terms of like some of the standard things that we've been talking about. So hit points are going to be 2.5 average because our magic user is going to use a D4 for their hit points, as you see on the table here. And we're not going to get a constitution bonus for that constitution of 12. So that's not changing anything. So 2.5 hit points at first level using that D4. Their armor class in AD&D is going to move to 10 for unarmored. So that is a change between advanced D&D and then the other versions of D&D that had come before, the BECMI version, Mulvey, Holmes even, and original D&D where the base armor class was 9. For unarmored. So this is going to be a base of 10. However, this character is going to get a bonus because of their dexterity. So remember, I rolled a 17 for the dexterity. It was very lucky. They're going to get a -3 defensive adjustment, which means that their base of 10 is going to go down to 7, which is interestingly enough the same that we had in the Mulvey book, Mulvey Cook Marsh, like BX version of D&D, and the BECMI version was also 7. Because that was a base of 9 and then a -2 defensive adjustment. But in AD&D, it's going to be -3 on a base of 10. But they're going to get a +2 on their missile fire. So that's one of the things that's very interesting about AD&D is that these bonuses and penalties, they're not standardized like they were in the BX version and the BECMI version. They differ. And a lot of times it might look like Gary was being arbitrary. I really don't think he was. Gary was very, very big into probabilities and statistics and using all these different dice to create different different probabilities. And so I think that he probably did sit down and do some kind of calculations, figuring out, moving the armor class to a base of 10 for unarmored. How does that change things? And it probably made sense to him to make those two numbers different. I don't really think that it was just him picking numbers out of a hat and deciding to make one higher than the other. I think there was probably some reasoning behind it, but, I don't know for sure. I just, knowing what I know, what I've read about Gary, that seems to be the case. Now, weapon-wise, this magic user is going to be able to use A few different weapons, more so than we've seen in the past. So this is going to tell us on the table here that they can use dagger, dart, and staff. So most likely they're still going to pick a dagger. That's what I'm going to use for the purposes of this, meaning that they're going to do 2.5 points of damage using that dagger during combat. However, one of the really interesting things that people kind of figured out, if you look at the table here in the player's handbook, it tells you for hurled weapons and missiles. So this would be things that you're throwing by hand, of course. You see that the dagger rate of fire is actually 2 per round if you're throwing them, but the dart is 3 per round. And it tells us that the dart damage on this table over here is going to be 1 to 3. So the average for a dart is actually 2. And if you're throwing 3 per round and you hit all 3 times, you're going to do an average of 6 points of damage. If you throw the dagger twice per round and you hit both times, you're going to do an average of 5 because 2.5 for each. So the dart actually is a little bit better, assuming you hit all 3 times. However, we do get that +2 bonus on our missile fire because of our dexterity. So you're a little bit better. And this table is going to tell us here, same table, if you use the weapon versus AC armor class adjustment, we see that the the dart gets a +1 to hit versus AC 10. And it gets a +1 to hit versus AC 8, which is padded armor. So I've talked about this before, but these armor class adjustments are very confusing because it's not the armor class of the character once adjustments are taken into effect. It really should read armor type. So it should have said like unarmored, padded, shield, leather, etc., but it doesn't say that. And so you kind of had to just know what that meant. But, if the magic user's throwing at a character of armor class 10, so an unarmored character like another magic user, they could throw 3 darts. Each one's going to be a +3 to hit, and they're going to do an average of 2 points of damage per dagger. Now, it's also possible that you could have created your character in advanced D&D using one of the different methods that are going to create higher than average characters, because AD&D is not 3d6 down the line. There's all these different options that are going to give you above average characteristics. It's possible you could have a magic user that actually has a strength bonus. Well, in AD&D, you get to apply your strength bonus to your hurled or thrown weapons. So even if you had a strength bonus of just +1 and you have 3 darts and you hit with all 3, you would be doing an extra 3 points of damage on top of the average. So that's pretty powerful, actually. Now, the downside of picking a dagger, if you picking a dart, if you were to do so, is that you're not going to get a magic dagger. So in the treasure tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are magic daggers as weapons that you could find. There are no magic darts. So, and the magic user only gets 1 weapon proficiency at first level, and they don't get another one until 7th level. It says they get 1 every 6 levels. So that means that they are only going to have, if they pick dart, they are going to go for 6 levels without getting a magic weapon. So now they're going to get other magic items that they could use, of course, and magic daggers aren't the end all be all of magic users. But if you wanted a magic dagger, for example, so that you could attack certain creatures that were immune to certain things, you would want to pick the dagger because there's no magic dart, is what I'm saying. Okay. So, but otherwise than that, it's pretty similar to what we've seen before. So now their intelligence here, let's get into the spell casting and figure out what's going to be different in here. And really quick, actually, before we get to intelligence, it's going to be a new thing. It's going to tell us that our magic user has to have a minimum of 6 dexterity score right here on this table for dexterity. That's new. That's something we haven't seen in previous editions of D&D, is that you need a minimum dexterity to be a magic user. It's also going to tell us on the intelligence table that you need a minimum intelligence of 9 to be a magic user. Again, something new. Now, in previous editions of D&D, you had like original D&D, you could be a magic user with intelligence 3. It didn't matter if you had that if you had an 18 or a 3. It had no impact on your character except for how fast or slow you gained experience points. AD&D is going to lock in and tell us that we have to have a minimum intelligence of 9, and that is also pretty consistent with the Moldvay and the BECMI versions of D&D, where it tells you that you do have to have minimums to be certain character classes. So this is doing a similar model, and this came first. AD&D came first before Moldvay and Cookmarsh. Okay, so now it's going to tell us that a level 18 intelligence, or a score of 18 intelligence, which our character has, that's the minimum intelligence that we need to cast 9th level spells. That's new. In the past, I think it was minimum 17. Now it's going to say 18. And then we're going to get 7 bonus languages. The real difference is going to come here on the table of ability for magic users. And it's going to tell us that its ability score of 18 in intelligence gives us an 85% chance to know a spell of the listed level. In the past, it was 95%. But this table goes to 19 or higher for the ability score. So they've moved 95% to the 19 or higher ability score. So 18 has dropped to 85%. It's also going to say the minimum number of spells per level is going to be 9, and the maximum number of spells per level is going to be 18. So that cap is new, because in the past, if it was 18, your maximum number of spells available was all, but this is going to cap it at 18. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of the differences as far as the spell casting for AD&D. Now, a couple of the things that happen with the spells in here is that AD&D is going to start implementing a lot more codified rules for spell casting, and that's very consistent because AD&D is all about codifying rules. And so it's going to tell us that magic users employ a greater variety of material components than do other character classes employing spells. So AD&D is going to codify the idea that spells have different kinds of components, and there are 3 different kinds of components you can have: verbal, somatic, which is like hand gestures, body movements, whatever, and then material components. Now, not all spells have all 3, and you see a lot of spells here, like this one, it says components VS, so that's verbal and semantic. So there are no material components to cast affect normal fires. Now, some spells, however, do. So you see enlarge says VSM, that's verbal, semantic, and material components, and it will tell you in the spell description usually what the material component can be. So it says the material component for this spell is a pinch of powdered iron. So that's one of the fun things I think about advanced D&D is this idea of spell components, and a lot of them, especially as you get into higher level spells, are very rare. They're expensive and they're rare, or one or the other or both, right? And so a lot of early adventures were crafted around the idea of magic users having to go hunting and searching and questing to find these material components for their spells. So I think that's a fun idea for an adventure. Now, I know a lot of people will say, well, that's boring for the other characters that aren't magic users, like they're just along for the ride. I just don't see it that way. I don't look at things like that, but I'm not someone who's looking that every character needs to have the spotlight every game. So I think it's kind of fun to do a quest for finding a material component so the magic user can have the spell that's going to benefit the whole party, ideally, at some point. So, and I use the system of verbal, semantic, and material components in the campaign I run for my daughter, even though Moldvay BX D&D doesn't really rely very heavily on material components, if at all. So, but I think it's a fun thing to add. It adds immersion to the game and the idea of spell casting. So, you have that. It also means that because you have these 3 different kinds of components, you could hamper your magic user by having them lose their spell components. So maybe their pouch is pickpocketed or whatever it is, but maybe they get captured and their material components are taken away. So they can't cast certain spells because of that. And then it could be part of the quest of recovering those or whatever it is. So there's a lot of adventure ideas built into this idea of the material components. And so you can hamper your magic users more than just binding and gagging them. So that's a big thing that's added here in the magic using section. Now, it's also going to tell us in the magic user description that to recover our spells after we've cast them, that it's going to take about 15 minutes. So that's a big change from what we saw earlier when it said it might take a whole day. This is going to say it's going to be 15 minutes, which is, much better, obviously. And it's 15 minutes per level of the spell. I should qualify that. Okay. And so it's going to just talk a little bit here about all the different description of the magic user. So it's nothing that we haven't seen before. But the one thing that we are going to see is that, as we've seen with every other edition, they start out by being able to cast 1 spell at first level. So they can cast one spell, but how many spells do they know? Well, that's going to come in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Very typical for advanced D&D. A lot of the rules that you'd think a player would need to know are actually not in the player's handbook. And that's very consistent with Gary Gygax's game design. He wanted to keep a lot of those rules away from the players because he didn't think that the players needed to know this. A lot of that is because Gary actually doesn't follow the rules that he writes in AD&D. He wants the flexibility to tell players, well, roll a die and I'll tell you what happens. I'll tell you if it succeeds. And so he's telling you to roll a die. And as a player, you don't roll the die unless the DM tells you to. So that's one thing. And then once you roll that die, the DM will tell you whether you were successful or not. You might not actually know because you don't have the tables. You don't have all the information. And the DM, in Gary's case, a lot of times is just deciding. And he tells us that many times in different interviews that he had over the years, especially later in life, where, you know, sometimes he said he was rolling dice and he was just actually making up what happens. So that's getting very far from the game element. But in any case, as we look in here in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's going to tell us on the acquisition of magic user spells that the magic user is going to assume to have been taught by some kind of high level master, okay, or mistress. And it says at least 6, unthinkably high level, at least 6th. And so they're going to start out with, they're going to need to write on a piece of paper, first level spells known, and that's going to become part of their character folio or whatever. And it's going to tell us in here, it talks all about, like, you know, rolling on the percentage chance of spells known and all that kind of stuff. And then it gets to, well, how many spells started in the spell book? And it says, well, they're going to start essentially with 4. And it says they automatically are going to know read magic because that is like the meat and drink of the magic user class is knowing read magic. They have to know that in order to read spells. And then they're going to select randomly 3 more spells, 1 each of offensive, defensive, and miscellaneous spells. And it gives a table here. I'm not going to read the whole table, but just as an example, offensive spells will include things like Burning Hands, Charm Person, Enlarge Friends, Light Magic Missile. And then defensive spells would be Affect Normal Fires, Dancing Lights, Featherfall, Hold Portal, etc. And miscellaneous spells would be Comprehend Languages, Detect Magic, Erase, Find Familiar, Identify, etc. Right? So you are going to start out, and this is going to help differentiate every magic user because and you're rolling is how you're picking these spells because each one is on a D10 table with the 10th one being choose, the 10th entry being choose. And so that helps us to differentiate our magic users so that every first level magic user is not picking sleep. So that was a common thing in early D&D to pick sleep because it is technically the most powerful first level spell, depending on which edition you're picking, but it puts so many characters to sleep. Oftentimes there's no saving throw associated with it. And because of that, you could wipe out a party of like first level dungeon monsters, first dungeon level monsters like goblins or kobolds or something like that, put them to sleep. And then, you know, the old school way was that the characters would then slit those monsters' throats so that they couldn't come back from sleep and attack them. So very, very a murder hobo style of play. But regardless of that part, the sleep spell was really powerful. Well, if you have every character picking sleep, it starts to get really, really boring very, very quickly. So the idea here in Advanced D&D is you were going to roll randomly on this table to figure out like which spells your magic user started with in their spell book. And then from there, you have your chance to find new spells during the game compared to that, you know, percent to know that spell. And then if you do know it, then you can add it to your spell book from that point on. Okay, so that was how you started out with spells in AD&D, and that's sort of like the quick version of the AD&D magic user. So it's really not all that different from what we've seen before. It's just, you know, picking how we know our spells is starting out differently. That intelligence table that started back in Greyhawk comes into AD&D. The numbers are different, but the concept is the same, right? It's not that different. And then, you know, the only other change being like the change in armor class for unarmored being 10. But other than that, it's everything else is pretty standard. Now, in 1985, we're going to see the release of Unearthed Arcana. And this is a collection of mostly articles that Gary Gygax wrote in Dragon magazine. And as we talked, the articles Gary wrote in Dragon were the official ones, right? So other things were just considered like, you know, they were unofficial, right? They told us that many times in Dragon magazine. But the thing Gary's going to add in here, a few different things. So one is going to be, as far as affecting the magic user, is going to be a little bit of an expansion on the kinds of weapons that the magic user can use. And that's going to be in a table here where we see that in addition to the dagger, dart, and staff, they've added caltrop, knife, and sling. So those are new weapons that you can take. Most likely you're going to take a dagger, but you might want to pick one of these other ones, and it does give you some different options. So that's a small tweak. The big change that's going to come in the magic users section. So magic user is the one like main class that, interestingly enough, does not have any entry in the class section here. But the big change comes when you get to the spells section, because the Unearthed Arcana is going to introduce the concept of cantrips or zero level spells. Now, again, these came from an article that Gary Gygax wrote in Dragon Magazine. So we had seen this before. There's really nothing new here if you had seen that article. But this is going to put into D&D officially this idea of cantrips. Now, if you're used to like say 5th edition cantrips, these are extremely different. The 5th edition cantrips actually do stuff. And to me, I don't really like that. But these cantrips these are more for flavor. So zero level spells, things like chill or clean or dampen or curdle, like, curdle milk or something. Or you could mute, or you could make someone belch or blink or cough. Okay. Or haunting cantrips, creak, footfall, groan, moan, rattle. So they're really fun and flavorful. Mechanically, they don't have a lot of impact on the game, but that's because they're zero level spells. This isn't like your Eldritch Blast for the Warlock in 5th edition, where they're doing damage every turn because it's a zero level cantrip. And they have it like, it never runs out kind of thing. AD&D is not like that. Magic is supposed to be mysterious and rare and maybe a little bit scary. And so you don't have that level of high level of magic in a standard AD&D game. But that's something that I quite like, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that don't like that. They think it's too limiting. I think, again, as I talked before, the limitations invites creativity. But that's the main thing that's going to come out of Unearthed Arcana, is the addition of cantrips. And then that's going to stay in the game from this point on. It's just that, again, in the future, cantrips are going to be made much more powerful. Okay, and the other main thing that's going to happen, this is in the DM section of Unearthed Arcana, is the section on spell books here. And essentially what it's going to tell you is that there's two kinds of spell books. There's standard spell books, and it tells you that they can each hold up to 36 cantrips. They can hold up to 24 spells of between 1st and 3rd level, or up to 16 spells of between 4 to 6 level, or up to 8 spells of 7th to 9th level. But then you have your traveling spell book, your traveling books, and it says it contains at most 1/4 of the number of spells possible to be contained in a standard spell book. So the idea here is that, again, they're reinforcing the idea that your standard spell books are big. They contain a lot of spells, but they're heavy, they're bulky, and you're not carrying them with you when you go into a dungeon on an adventure. But it's creating the traveling spell book. So the idea of knowing which of these spell books, like which of these spells do I want to put in my traveling spell book that I might need on this adventure so that I can have access to it, but I'm going to leave my bulk of my spell books, which, is at a certain point, because you know so many spells, it's almost like a little mini library, right? You're not carting around a library of spells. So your traveling spell book is for the adventurer, right? And then your regular spell books are for when you're back in town or back at wherever your home base is. And then you're copying things around and creating new traveling spell books and things like that, so that you have different versions depending on what kind of spells you think you're going to need. So that is another thing that happens here in Unearthed Arcana. It's going to kind of come into the game from that point on. This idea of like, how do you carry your spell books? Okay. So that's Unearthed Arcana. Now let's go ahead in time to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, 1989. So this is going to be written by Dave Zeb Cook. So Gary Gygax at this point, again, has left the company. And so this book is written by someone else. Now, the ability scores that we calculated before, the bonuses and penalties are going to be exactly the same as what we saw in AD&D. There's going to be no change there. So the only real difference here is going to be like a few things become optional. As an example, the maximum number of spells per level based on your intelligence is an optional rule. If you decide to use it, it works the exact same way as before, but it just becomes optional if you want to limit how many spells a person knows based on their intelligence, okay? But at 18, we have an 85% chance to know spells. To check to see if we know spells. And then you see our maximum number of spells, if we decide to use that, is 18. Okay, so, but otherwise, it's pretty much standard for what we've seen before. So the weapons in for our magic user in AD&D are going to be pretty much what we saw in Unearthed Arcana. They're just going to remove the caltrip. So it's dagger, dart, knife, sling, and staff. Those are our different kinds of weapons that we can use. Our armor class is going to be the same, a base of 10, -2 for that dexterity. So that's going to get us to an armor class of 7. Okay, and then our hit points are going to be 2.5. That's the average of a D4 at first level. There's going to be no constitution bonus for a constitution of 12. So that's all the same, right? Everything's the same. The real big change to me in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition is that we're no longer going to use the term magic user. That term is gone as of 2nd edition, and it's not going to ever come back in official Dungeons & Dragons products, either by TSR or Wizards of the Coast. Now, what happens in 2nd edition is they are going to create these 4 classifications or 4 types of characters, and that's going to be the warrior class or warrior classification, which includes fighters, paladins, and rangers. And then you're going to have the priest class that includes clerics and druids. And then later on, especially priests. You're going to have the rogue class, which includes thieves and bards. And so this is the first time that we see rogue used in conjunction with Dungeons and Dragons. But it's not rogue as a class. It's a type. So you are a rogue type character, and the 2 types that you can be are either thieves or bards. And then the magic user type is going to be renamed wizard. And within the wizard classification of classes, you can be a mage, which is a generalist wizard, or you can be a specialist, which is going to specialize in one of the schools of magic. So we had seen in Advanced D&D the spells descriptions start to kind of classify the spells into certain types. So you see message is an alteration spell, as is mending. And we see friends is an enchantment charm spell. And we see, what are some other ones here? Find familiar is conjuration and summoning. So it's telling you what form of magic it is, but it's not really expanded on in here. There is the illusionist subclass that appears in here. And I have a whole video on the history of the illusionist class or subclass. It originally appears as a subclass for magic user for original D&D. And that is going to be in Strategic Review magazine, written by somebody completely different. And then Gary Gygax is going to take that, pretty much lift it as is, and put it into Advanced D&D 1st edition. But he's going to, change it a little bit so that it's closer to the Advanced D&D rules. It doesn't have to change too much. But AD&D, 1st edition, doesn't really go beyond that. So I know people did it. They did their own things. But like as far as official publications from TSR, they're not going to delve into this idea of specialty wizards and explain to you too much how to do it, at least in the materials that I have. So it's possible that I missed something that was an official AD&D 1st edition publication from TSR that talked about specialty wizards, but to my knowledge, I don't believe that exists. However, in 2nd edition, they're going to tell you some rules on how you can make specialty wizards, what the opposition schools are. You get bonus spells from your specialty school if you choose to be a specialist, but you're prohibited from learning spells from your opposition school. And then they're going to tell you in here, in the player's handbook, here's an example of a specialty wizard, and it's the illusionist. So they're only going to give you one in here, but they're going to tell you a little bit about how to make other ones if you want to do that on your own. So that's 2nd edition, and that's really the big change in this, is the expansion of the specialty wizards idea beyond just the illusionist, and of course the rechanging of the name magic user. We're not going to use that anymore. They're still going to get plus 10% to the experience points for having that high intelligence. And the other thing that's going to happen in here that's going to be a little bit different is figuring out how many spells the character knows at 1st level. This is going to be different. It is also going to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is a book for 2nd edition I just don't own. So I do have it as a PDF. I just don't own the physical copy. But in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's going to tell you to figure out your spells at 1st level. You have 3 ways of doing it. The player can choose. The Dungeon Master lets the player choose the spells, or the DM can choose the spells for the player. Or you can roll 3d4 to determine how many spells that you know. And within that, you have to have 2 of those spells be Read Magic and detect magic. So those are, you have to have those. So if you roll 3d4 and roll poorly, you only get 3. Well, 2 of your 3 slots are for spells known are used up by read magic and detect magic. But that's how you figure out your starting spells for 2nd edition advanced D&D. And other than that, it's very, very similar to 1st edition advanced D&D characters. And as you can see going through this, in general, across all these editions, things are very, very similar. So, the armor class is always going to be the worst it can be at either 9 or 10, depending on, whether you're using the Dungeons and Dragons system or the advanced Dungeons and Dragons system. You have using a dagger for damage. Usually they can always use a dagger, and that dagger is usually going to do D4 damage unless you're using the systems where it does dice 6, where every weapon does dice 6. And then you have their starting hit points being usually a D4, so 2.5, unless you're using original D&D before Greyhawk, in which case their starting hit points would be an average of 3.5 because everybody has a D6 for their hit die. And then they're always going to cast 1 spell per day at level 1 across every edition of these games that we've looked at. So the real difference becomes how many spells do they actually know, and how do they carry them in their book, and how long does it take them to replenish those spells once they've cast them. Those are the differences that are going to change. There's also going to be differences, between how spells are cast, the verbal, somatic, material components. Is it all of those? Is it none of those? Is it some of them? Whatever it is. So those little details change, but at its core, I think the magic user actually changed less over time than the fighter that we just talked about, which is interesting because the fighter is looked at as being a simpler class, but I think more changes were made to it over time than the magic user, which stays pretty consistent. Now we're going to have some expansions to the magic user, and I'm going to look at just 2 things here, which is going to be the Complete Wizard's Handbook, starting out with. This is from 1990. It's for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And in this book, I have a whole video on the complete handbooks for 2nd edition, so you'll want to check that out if you want to learn more about what these books are about. But this book, the Complete Wizard's Handbook, is going to really expand on this idea of the schools of magic, and it's going to give us much more detail on creating specialist wizards and how they work and the pros and cons of playing those and that kind of thing. It's also going to tell us how to create new schools of magic if we want to do that. And then it's going to do some of the standard stuff. It's got wizard kits. All these books have kits in them, which are like little tweaks made with benefits and hindrances for balance to kind of change your wizard so you could be like an academician or an Amazon sorceress or a patrician or a witch or like whatever. And it's going to give you some rules on that. And then it's got some role playing, some wizard personalities here, which is applicable for any kind of game that you might want to use. It has ideas for wizard adventures, magic in the campaign world, and it talks about worlds with excessive amounts of magic or worlds with low amounts of magic, etc. An all wizard campaign, that kind of thing. So a lot of this stuff is useful no matter what edition you're playing, again, to help you with your world building. Combat with the wizard, all that kind of stuff. Advanced procedures, spells higher than 9th level is an interesting concept. How to, reveal illusions, spell research, researching existing spells. And then this is my favorite part of this whole book, and this is something I use in my daughter's campaign, even though we played 1981 BX D&D. This is the wizardly lists. So it includes things like 25 helpful familiars or 5 unusual sources for spells, 9 magical items that have not yet been invented, 5 debilitating afflictions, 9 principles of contact for academy graduates, 6 common alchemical processes, on and on and on, right? That kind of stuff is gold for my kind of game. There's almost no mechanics in this at all. It's just ideas. It's world building. I love that kind of stuff. So I get a lot of use out of this book, but mostly from that section I was just talking about. But this really does expand the idea of the specialty wizards in advanced D&D. 2nd edition. Now, there was a line of books that came out for the BECMI version of D&D, and that is the Gazetteers. These were done mostly they're expanding the world of Mystra, which was originally known as the Known World. I have a video on that if you want to hear the history of that campaign, but that was the default campaign setting for the BECMI line of D&D, just like Greyhawk was originally the default campaign setting for advanced D&D 1st edition. Okay, so these Gazetteers explained all these different cultures and nations in the world of Mystra, and my favorite one is probably this one, The Principalities of Glantri. This is written by Bruce Hurd, who kind of ended up being the shepherd of Mystra after a while, wrote a very famous series of articles in Dragon magazine called Voyage of the Princess Arc, which was my favorite thing to look forward to in Dragon during the time period that he was writing those, that helped expand the world into other continents and other areas that weren't talked about in the main books. And the Principalities of Glantri are it's a nation ruled by a bunch of magic using families that are each like their own faction, and the history of these families I found fascinating. There's a vampire one, and there's a family, there's two different families that come from like an alternate fantasy gothic earth, one from France and one from Scotland, and I think that's really awesome, and it ties back into module X2 Castle Amber, if you've ever heard of those. So one of the families is the family d'Amberville, right? So I really loved that idea and the tie back all the way to that original, module X2. But the thing that I really thought was cool about this is in the back, they talk about the 7 secret crafts of Glantri. And these are like magic using schools. This is 1987. This is 2 years before Advanced D&D Second Edition comes out. And they're already talking about this idea of like, you could look at these as being like specialists. So they have alchemists, and they give you all these different things like that they can do that are beyond standard magic users. They have dracologists for dragons. They have elementalists. They have illusionists. You've got necromancers. You've got cryptomancers, which is about knowing somebody's true name. And you have witches. And then you have the Secret of the Radiance. So I love that kind of stuff for expanding the idea of like how to make magic users different. And that's one of the things a lot of folks do with magic users. It seems to be, the magic system and the magic user class seems to be one of the first things people like to tweak and fiddle with and try to change and make it their own thing in an advanced D&D game or a regular D&D game. It just seems so open to try to change it, right? So I like using the Vancian magic system. But I do like to try to expand the role-playing opportunities for magic users, again, so it gets away from this idea that they're not useful after they've cast their spell for the day. So very similarly to what I talked about before, I wrote a series of articles on my blog years ago called Make Your Character Weird. And I talked about in the fighter one, there's a D20 table for making fighters weird that don't really have mechanics associated with them. It's just something that you might want to role play as your fighter. Well, I did a similar thing for the magic users. And the magic user one was really fun. My friend Kelvin Green, he's a designer, has written a lot of old school Renaissance adventures for different game systems. But he's also illustrated a lot of things. And he mentioned in the comments on that one, he's like, because the Magic Users one was the last one I posted of the original 7 BX classes. And he said he thought I had the most fun writing that one just from reading the writing. And he's probably right. But it also helped that it was the 7th one I'd written, so I was getting in a groove. But I have that table on my blog, but if you'd like to see it in a format that's easy to read, because the tables don't really translate well into the blog format, just drop me an email. I'll put my email here up on the screen, and I'll send you like a different formatted version that's easier to read. But it's ideas for things like, who was your master? So you could roll on this table to figure out like who your master was. And then there's a subtable to show you that. Or the person that taught you magic, by when I say master, that's what I mean. Or like, what kind of spell book do you carry? Maybe it's not a book, then what format is it in? Or what kind of unique components do you have in your spell pouch that might be different than other people? So it's stuff like that kind of help you expand and make your magic users more fun and different, add some personality, right? So you can grab that from my table. But again, I think it's just this idea that like people like to play around with and expand on this magic user idea. But that's going to be it for this particular video. So I'm going to wrap it up now. And I'd like to ask that if you, I'd like for you to share in the comments, like which version of the magic user do you like best? Do you like one from one of these particular editions of D&D that we talked about? Are you one of those types of people who thinks that these original versions of magic users are far too limiting and they're not fun to play, and that you'd rather play somebody who knows all the spells or a lot of spells and can cast spells multiple times a day because that's how you want to play the game? And that's fine. I would just love to hear from that in the comments. Again, be respectful, and just kind of share your thoughts on the magic user, and let me know what you think about that. And then while you're in the comments down below, you can also find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. I've already shared all the links to my my shop and where you can buy my book and all that. So that's all down below. And I would like to also point out that I'm going to be doing my first ever live stream coming up probably in mid-August. This isn't going to be a regular thing on the channel, and it's not going to be replacing a regular video. So if you're a person who doesn't like live streams, don't worry. There will still be a regular scripted video that week. But I'm going to be talking to the Arduin folks, the people at Emperor's Choice Miniatures and Games, so the current rights holders to Arduin, because they saw my video on Arduin and asked me if I could do a live stream with them just to talk about things. And so I just chatted with them yesterday to kind of prep for it. And they've got a lot of interesting things to share. And so I'd love for you to tune into that, even if you're not someone who normally watches a live stream video. But that will be coming up like mid-August, and I'm going to be doing a poll, a community poll, to ask folks what would be the best time to do the live stream so that you'll be available to chime in and ask questions live to the folks on the chat. All right, so that'll be coming up soon. Be on the lookout for that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching the video. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So this time I'm going to start with the record because it's going to lead into what I'm drinking here. Whoops, lost my lemon peel. So today's July 18th, 2025, and 65 years ago today, this album was released. This is Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain, arranged and conducted by Gil Evans. So this is one of Miles's most famous albums. He did a series of albums with Gil Evans as the conductor and the arranger. Poor Game Bass is one of those, which I really like as well. But Sketches of Spain is an example of what's known as third stream music. So it's not quite jazz. It's sort of like a blend of jazz with classical and then world music. So a lot of contemporary reviews at the time didn't like this album. They thought it was confusing, and that they thought that it they said like it's not jazz. That was one of the critics told Miles Davis, "They're like, this isn't jazz, is it?" And he says it's music, and I like it. Miles was also famous for he didn't like the word jazz. So, but in any event, this takes a classic song called the Concierto de Aranjuez and kind of expands it to being almost half the entire album is that one song. And it's originally a song that was written for classical Spanish guitar, and Miles is going to play the main theme on a combination of the flugelhorn and the trumpet. And I quite like it. It is very different. I will tell you, it's a challenging listen, especially if you're expecting something like a Kind of Blue or like the typical Miles that you know. This is not going to be that at all. But I would encourage you, like I think part of exploring music is just like food or drink or anything else is to constantly challenge ourselves for something that like we might think that we don't like or we don't understand it, and then to really kind of spend time with it to figure out like what it is and what this music does. So I would encourage you to listen. My understanding of this is that Miles Davis is that the wife, Frances, I believe it was Frances at the time. She had Miles go with her to Spain and like listen to all these different kinds of music. And when he got back home in New York, he went to a record store and basically bought every flamenco album that they had that he could find, or every Spanish album, and spent time with it. And then like that was where the concept for this album kind of came from. So again, not a traditional Miles album, but I would encourage you to give it a chance and a listen. And I think it's kind of fun. Now, my version here, you can see it even says it was curated by Carlos Santana. So this is actually it's just a different packaging. It's on this yellow swirl vinyl. But it's a great album, and I highly encourage you to give it some time, check it out, and see what you think. Now, because we're doing Spanish, I decided to celebrate the idea of the Spanish. It's called the La Hora del Vermut, and which is the vermouth hour. And this is a Spanish custom. It's starting to come back. It kind of had faded away for a while, but it's the idea of spending time sort of like usually before lunch. So it's around the time of between noon and 2, which is also the time that I'm recording my video here, and it's having some vermouth, which traditionally would be served on the rocks, sometimes with a splash of soda water. I don't particularly like that, but a lot of people do. And then normally you'd add like an orange slice or some lemon. I added a lemon peel here. And drinking some vermouth. And traditionally, you'd want Spanish vermouth. I was out of Spanish vermouth, so I'm using Italian vermouth. I'm just using Cocchi del Torino, but you have the vermouth with like some snacks. So traditional snacks, usually salty, so like olives, salted nuts, or sometimes, especially during that time, they'll do potato chips, like homemade potato chips. So this is something that you can easily replicate at home. Buy a bottle of vermouth, pour it over ice with some, like an orange slice or a lemon slice or something like that, and just sit and relax. And it's a social hour. The idea is that you're not just drinking it by yourself. You're spending time. You're slowing things down. Even though modern life is very, very busy and people are always moving around, you're gonna slow everything down, and you're gonna sip on this drink and have some snacks and just talk about what's going on with your life or during your day with your friends or your loved ones or both, right? So, and that's something that you can easily bring back into your everyday life. My wife and I like to do vermouth hour actually before dinner. So we'll do it like while we're cooking together. So we are moving around. We're not stopping, I guess, but we'll pour just a little glass of vermouth and we'll sip on it. We'll just chat about stuff while we're making dinner in the kitchen, and listen to some music as we do so. She would not listen to Sketches of Spain. She hates this album. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is that when she was pregnant, we used to listen to, or she would listen to, like the Music Choice channel on cable. This is before streaming services were a big thing. And so she would put it on the jazz station at night to help her relax and calm down. Well, the Concierto de Aranjuez song has some very loud parts. It's a very quiet song, but every once in a while it gets very loud and very fast. And it seemed like they must have played it every night almost, and it would just jar her awake, and she gets so angry, and so now she just won't have anything to do with it. But I would listen to it were I having vermouth hour with some other folks, and so I encourage you to do that. Give the album a listen, give a little vermouth a try. The key tip on vermouth is that once you open that bottle, it needs to go into your refrigerator. So if you've ever thought that you don't like vermouth because it tastes terrible, it's most likely because the person didn't store it correctly. You don't keep it for a year on the top shelf in the heat. You put it in your fridge and you drink it within like 3 to 4 weeks of having opened it. Okay, at the latest. Okay, so that's going to be it. Cheers. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to do a little sip here. I should say salud since it's Spanish. And I will chat with you next time.